Sorry.
I pressed got it and there we go, we're back in action, I think, yes. So thanks very much, everybody. I'm going to go through some broad brush things. I do want to point out that you can't apply everything I say precisely in every location in exactly the same way, because every single site you visit will have slight differences. So broad brush is all I'm doing. I'm not trying to be totally prescriptive about any site, but you can ask questions as we go along, and I will pause periodically so that if you've put anything in the chat or raised your hand, all of which is available at the bottom bar when you're in this Zoom meeting mode, then Carla will stop me and say, yes, we've got some questions, and we'll deal with them and move on. So please feel free to ask, because I know that it's often annoying if you've got a question and then there's no opportunity until right at the end when you've forgotten precisely what it was you wanted to say. Okay, so habitat management, and you can see some people here doing some very labor-intensive habitat management. Why bother? And I'm just going to very quickly go through the fact. I'm not going to read you all these bits of information, but you will see that invertebrates in particular are doing badly. Right at the bottom here, where my mouse is moving around, you will notice that the UK is woeful. Out of 218 countries which could be assessed, because there's enough data to do any sort of assessment, we are right near the bottom. And it isn't just that we are bad at looking after nature. We are especially bad, and this is the whole world, at looking after invertebrates. Look at this, just 2% of the effort to conserve wildlife goes on conserving invertebrates. And it's definitely the case across the whole of Europe that things are bad, but in Britain things are probably worse than many other countries, because we've got such a large number of people crammed into a relatively small space, all competing for the land use. So yes, there is a lot of bad news, but there are positive signs. For instance, that where people are doing conservation work, where people are looking after the land, they can see things improving. So we're going to go through some things that can be done which do make a difference. There isn't any question at all. This isn't wishful thinking. They genuinely do make a difference. The research you can look at if you wish to. This is a paper called Decline of Butterflies in Europe, Problems, Significance and Possible Solutions, which goes into detail. I've just highlighted this little bit here. There is evidence that practical conservation can successfully reverse. So that's just one paper that I came across when I searched for a bit of evidence that this is true. And a little bit later, we'll see a piece from the most recent UK BMS data, which says that last year it was a particularly good example of how conservation work is paying dividends. You can look at the large scale, landscape scale conservation and evidence that this works best in this particular paper, which again is UK BMS, but you could get it by going to the UK BMS website or to the Butterfly Conservation website for free download. You can read it for nothing, in other words. The whole idea of this sort of work is that looking after a tiny pocket handkerchief sized piece of land will do some good, but looking after a bigger patch, which is connected to other patches, is even better. One of the things that I felt I ought to say right at the beginning is that we can make a really big difference, but we have to remember when we meet landowners and people who are looking for advice that we mustn't steamroller them and give them the impression that we know best, that they're getting it wrong and that they should be doing something different, especially if they've already spent money on doing whatever they're doing and what you're asking is going to cost them a lot more. So yes, quite often you will get the situation like the one in this cartoon. You will go and look at a piece of land where someone tells you that they're doing a whole load for wildlife, but in actual fact, when you assess it, you'll see that actually you do an awful lot wrong and not very much right. But you've got to pick out the positives and be encouraging, because it doesn't do any good to say flatly to people, well, that's rubbish. They won't listen to the rest of the discussion if you begin on that foot. So try, even when it's hard, try to find some positives. definitely the best way in. Right then, well, global warming is helping some species, and that's nothing to do with conservation work. That's sort of the exact opposite, isn't it? The fact that we're messing up the world, but it is helping some species. So this species, dingy skipper, is being helped by global warming because it's gone from having a single brood every year in the UK to having 2 broods. And that has helped it to breed both in the spring and again in the late summer. And there appears to be, therefore, an increasing number of the butterfly. It's helped this little butterfly, which used to feed solely on rock rose. It appeared to be the only plant that its caterpillars could digest in time to get between the caterpillar stage and the adult stage sufficiently quickly that it worked for them. But now they've started to eat various cranesbills and storksbills as well, which means with new food plants which grow in different situations, they can now exploit new habitats. And that's all down to the fact that being slightly warmer, their digestive processes work sufficiently well to allow them to tackle more than one food plant. And global warming, along with another human nasty, the nitrogen pollution that we're causing, and possibly something which is a positive spin-off from all this talk about conservation, the awareness that people should be looking after their grassland without mowing it all the time or ignoring it completely all the time. That does seem to be having benefits because species like this one, the marbled white, has increased locally by 49%, and that's an increase in both the numbers of the butterfly, but most particularly in its distribution. It's spread to lots of new areas. A beautiful butterfly that we're all very pleased to see spreading. And we think that's down in part to global warming and also the fact that the grasses it lives in, the caterpillars live on, are doing better now in various bits of the countryside. But another species which eats grass is doing less well. So this is an Essex skipper, and its numbers have decreased. So it isn't all necessarily good just because one grassland species is doing better. It doesn't necessarily follow that all the grassland species will. As I say, this is quite a complicated field and we're just doing broad brushstrokes. But just to point out that you might increase the numbers of one butterfly on a site by the actions you take, but you might at the same time decrease those of others. So you have to bear that in mind. Okay, but given the right habitat, every single plant, invertebrate and larger animal the populations can be stabilized, and you can definitely increase their numbers. You can help them. It is possible. You just need to know what it is that is required in each case. And this is the bit I was talking about. This is a press release from 2 days ago that last year, 2021, the number of butterflies and the distribution of butterflies were both adversely affected. We had some really dreadful early summer weather. As it says down here, you might better read it. 2021 was poor, the overall picture. Most butterflies suffered, but very encouragingly, for those of us who want to do some habitat management, the only species that didn't suffer were the ones that get targeted conservation work. So like the heath fritillary in the picture, which actually increased when all around it other butterflies were doing less well. Those getting special help did better. We're going to begin by looking at grasslands and what can be done there, and you'll see I've laid out that we're going to look at 8 different ways of tackling grasslands. And I thought I'd better just say, although I'm calling it grasslands, it's not actually grass that we really want to help. We really want to help the grasses to be a little bit less dominant and all these different flowering plants to be more dominant. It doesn't matter what the soil is, you can get some flowering plants in there or lots of flowering plants in there if you can lower the fertility. Now this goes against the grain for most land managers. As you can imagine, if you're a farmer and you've got cattle or sheep on the land, the idea that you lower the fertility of the land and grow less grass and thereby bulk up your sheep, cows, horses, whatever it is, more slowly, well, that seems daft, doesn't it? So there have been decades of land managers deliberately or inadvertently raising the fertility of the soil. And that's why wildflower meadows have virtually disappeared because you cannot have a wildflower meadow in an area of high soil fertility. It just doesn't happen. And there are various ways that you can reduce the fertility of the soil. The most obvious one is to remove it. So if you're lucky enough to live in an area where you can scrape the topsoil off because it's a very thin layer, this is definitely the quickest way to get good results. So in the picture at the top, the larger picture, you can see these chalky areas, which are where a very thin topsoil has been scraped off an arable field, and then the soil that's been scraped off has been pushed into what are called bunds around the outside, where they help to form a windbreak. So as you can see, this is a hilltop, and the wind blowing across here would be quite strong. But by pushing the soil to form a little bank all the way around, you can keep the site relatively sheltered from the wind. It's still going to be a bit chilly on top of a hill, but less than it would be if it was a flat surface. So this bank provides a little bit of windbreak, rather like you might put up on the beach when you go sunbathing on the east coast of England and wonder why you bothered because it's always too cold. Anyway, I digress. So down the bottom in a smaller picture, you can see an area here. I hope you can detect that there are quite a lot of small yellow flowers growing here. That's kidney vetch, in fact, in amongst the grasses. And that's because here, 6 years previously, it looked like this. All that soil was pushed off and pushed into a bank here because the prevailing wind comes from behind. And now this area grows flowers that are not seen in anything like the same profusion on the rest of the site. So we have an area here which is concentration of certain sorts of flowers, ones that we had hoped to see. So that was good news. And this method, although obviously quite costly because you've got to get the equipment in, and relatively damaging in terms of the way it looks to begin with, is extremely useful at controlling lots of rampant grass or bramble, nettles and so on, if that's what you've got on a site that you want to make more like a wildflower meadow. And once you've got the fertility down, and that isn't necessarily by scraping the surface off, but that does work. Once you've got the fertility down, we're going to talk about some other ways of doing that in a minute, you can put in plants. So plants that have been out-competed previously because the fertility has been too high can be reintroduced. Now you could simply wait to see if they come up on their own, which is possibly the best method, but it's a bit long term and you might need 10 years before you start to see any change. So most people prefer to shortcut slightly because a lot of us doing conservation are older folks, and 10 years from now we might not be able to get out there and have a look. So people are planting, and here they're planting horseshoe vetch. I don't know if you can see it in the pots, but they're planting horseshoe vetch in, which is the food plant for these two beautiful blue butterflies, chalkhill blue and the adonis. And on this particular site, the chalkhill has already recolonized after being lost because the horseshoe vetch had all disappeared from this site. But now that it's back, so is the chalkhill, but the adonis hasn't made it yet. If you can't scrape, and in many places you probably can't, because either there isn't the money available to pay for it, because it's just problematic getting in there and making a mess of the place, you get too many complaints from people and so on, then something that might work is mowing. But you must remove the arisings. Remove all the arisings. It really is critically important. Mowing the area and not removing the arisings will raise the soil fertility, and we're trying to lower it. Every single time that you cut any vegetation, if you leave that vegetation where it fell on the soil surface, various microorganisms will rot it down, and all the nutrients in it will go back into the soil. Every single year, the roots of the plants growing in the soil will suck up more nutrients. They will suck up the nutrients from the stuff that's died recently and been left in situ, but they will also bring up nutrients from deeper down. So each time you cut them, you're simply improving the amount of nutrient, and we're trying to decrease it, not increase it. So you have to remove all the cuttings. They've got to go somewhere, and this can be an issue, but it is not a good idea to mow and leave the cuttings. In very fertile soil, as I've said, you might need to do this for years, because it takes a long time removing all those bits and pieces that you cut, whether it's just simply grass or grass and flowers or grass and scrub. Once you've cut it and removed it, you will slowly take the fertility down, but it might take 4 years if you've got a very fertile soil. And even then, after 4 years, it's the time that you'll be beginning to see a difference as opposed to the time that you'll have finished. So you might need to make several cuts a year, as many as 4 a year, 5 a year to begin with. And you're cutting quite high, notice 7 centimeters at this stage. But later on, you're going to cut once a year, but down to a much closer to the soil at 5 centimeters. So once you get the soil to the sort of fertility level that you think is working, you revert to the plan that you would have had if you'd scraped, which is to cut it once at about 5 centimeters. But before that, you cut it regularly at 7 centimeters. And as you notice here, it says, after the plants have set and distributed seed. So this depends really on what sort of meadow you're trying to create. One of the reasons why hay meadows are cut fairly early in the year, June, July, was to stop the flowers from setting and distributing seed. You might think, what? Why? Well, because their farmers were trying to keep livestock in these fields, and they wanted the grass. So they were trying to cut and stop the flowers from spreading so that they had more grass. But we're trying to do the opposite these days. We're trying to set the clock back to the way it was. So we're cutting once after the plants have set and distributed seed. But you might get to a stage with this piece of land, this fictitious bit of land we're looking after, where you say, you know what, I've actually got too much knapweed, or I've got too much marjoram. And then you might want to bring the cut forward to cut it so that it doesn't get the chance to set seed. But that's something that has to be judged. As I said, each site is slightly different. And here we can see a site where there was very long grass, which you can still see in the background, look. And it was agreed that this would be cut and all the material that was cut would be collected, but it wasn't. And as in this little picture shows here, you've got these great piles, masses and masses of cut material, because unfortunately the man that came in and cut the grass turned up and said, I'm sorry, my machinery for cutting and collecting is broken. I've only got the cutter, so we're just going to cut it. And that's what he did, promising to come back. So it was dropped. But as you can see, these thick layers of dead material, anything relatively small and delicate that's trying to grow underneath that is going to die. This very soon mats together into what's called a thatch, and smaller plants underneath just cannot get through this. Big fuggish plants, many of the tougher grasses and things like brambles, they can push through it without any trouble. But relatively small, delicate plants can't get back. So that's why we don't want to cut and drop the material, because it smothers the plants. And then as this thatch gradually rots down over the next few years, it will raise the nutrient level of the grass that it's landed on top of, making it grow even faster and making it even more difficult because of the competition for the small plants. Anyway, the chappie didn't come back, so here's Muggins, along with a team of others, it wasn't just me, and we raked the grass off to the edges of the site in order to give the ground underneath a chance. Thankfully, this picture was taken about 3 weeks ago, and what we're trying to do with this site is what we were just talking about with another site. Well, we can't scrape this site, but we can cut it repeatedly. So here's the second cut, and this time he's come back. So at the back of the red tractor is a blue hopper, and as he cuts, it collects. It's like a bit like a vacuum in here. There's blades on the cutting part below the grass into the hopper at the back, and then he trundles across and tips it into this truck behind the other tractor, the orangey one, and then they took that away and disposed of it at the local recycling centre, where they turn it into compost. So it's been cut, it's been collected, And you can see a difference, can't you? I mean, you can see a bit of this slide poking out around the edge still, all that dead material in here, nice and clean. So this will give these patches, bare ground, a chance for things to germinate and grow that were definitely not getting a chance before. Now, on Saturday, we're going to Colestroke Farm, and this picture was taken at Colestroke. And here you can see a much bigger hopper on here, dumping into this machinery, because what they were doing on this site, here is a field which has already been restored as a wildflower meadow. And the idea is to turn some of the other fields at the farm we're going to on Saturday into similar wildflower meadows. So they collected by cutting and collecting into a hopper, tipping it into this device on the back of this mower, and you'll see what happens next in this field. So we're down in a different field now, and here we go. The material that's been cut, and along with all the seeds which have come out of those flowers when it was cut, are being blown into another field. And in this way, you can spread the wildflowers growing in one field to one, in this case, only a few hundred meters away. Right, a bit noisy, isn't it? Anyway, so that's a very good result. Now I'll stop before I go on to grazing just to see, Carla, has anyone raised any questions yet?
No, we have no questions for the moment. I'm just following all of the pictures of machinery. Thank you very much.
That's right. For those who like machinery, that was a good bit. I'm afraid you'll have to live on that because there's not much more. Okay, grazing can achieve better results. I say can. It won't always, but it usually does, because when you mow something, the mower is set to cut the particular height. And assuming that you go over the whole site, it means the whole site is cut to that height. And that isn't what we want. We don't want everything the same. We want it to be as diverse or heterogeneous, I think the word is, as we can get it. And one of the good things about grazing animals is that they don't go across the whole site and graze everything down to the same height, assuming that you haven't put too many animals in and left them for too long. So assuming that the animals on your field have got plenty of food and they can choose to eat the bits they like best and leave alone the bits they don't fancy, you will get all sorts of different heights in the vegetation, and some plants will be left alone completely because whichever grazing animals you've got in there have decided they don't like them. You've still got to think about the timing. It's not the case usually, but simply sticking livestock in and leaving it all year round is a good thing. You normally have to think about taking the livestock out at certain times, because otherwise they will eat the flowers that you want to set seed. And sometimes the livestock will eat the invertebrates, not wittingly, they don't do it on purpose, but they're eating the leaves on which the invertebrates are feeding, and they eat them too, because they don't stop because they think there might be something feeding on the leaf, they just eat the lot. One of the big problems with grazing in modern days is dogs. It really is a problem. I'm afraid I have no brilliant solution to this. There are more and more dogs about all the time, and those of you who have perhaps tried to set up grazing on any land that you're looking after for someone else will know that it becomes increasingly difficult to find anyone who's prepared to put livestock into fields where people walk their dogs, because dogs attack the livestock. No matter how many signs you put up saying that the dog should be on a lead, people think they know better, let the dog off. Livestock runs away and the dogs chase it. It's just unfortunate, there we are. So you're going to need fencing, and one of the good things about fencing is that to an extent it can be used to keep dogs out, but it doesn't work perfectly because their owners will often introduce the dogs over the fence so they can have a good run around. But it possibly keeps dogs out. It should keep the stock in so they graze the bit you want. And as you can see here with this somewhat Heath Robinson fencing that we put up one day to protect a bit, we didn't want the sheep coming in here. We did want them out here, so we put up some temporary fencing so that we could get some bits grazed quite hard, and other bits, we took the fencing down later, they grazed it very lightly. So we got a difference in the way that the sheep affected the land. So with temporary fencing, and you can get temporary electric fencing, which is a bit less labour intensive than all this, which was just good old wire fencing, then you can control where the animals graze and how long they graze those sections. You can move them around. But something else you need to worry about if you're going to have animals grazing is water. You cannot simply put animals onto the land and leave them. You've got to go back and check that they've got fresh water at regular intervals. That's daily with cows, and it's every couple of days with sheep. Sheep in the winter will probably not need any water, but you've still got to provide it. So there are, unfortunately, downsides to grazing, which is that it is a bit more labour intensive. Someone's got to go and look at this livestock on a regular basis, make sure the fences are still sound, make sure that none of the animals have come to any harm, and check for water. So grazing gives a far better result, but it isn't always, well, it's never as easy as mowing because you just get a man in for the day, but it isn't usually any cheaper either because of all the extra things that go with it. And I just wanted to point out that if you do put sheep on the land and you leave them there for too long, or you put too many in, even for a short time, they'll produce this very uniform texture. So I know this is a dreadful picture. I haven't got one of my own. I stole this from a website somewhere. But you can see around the sheep, they've grazed this right down to the ground. And that will happen, happens with horses in many places, because lots of people have horses they put on the land, and they haven't really got enough land for the number of horses. And in a dry summer, they eat it right down to the ground. Sheep do the same. Cows aren't quite so bad normally, because normally the farmers are much more careful with cows, but they can, if you leave grazing animals on one piece of land too long, they can actually damage it. And this picture shows very nicely. This is the same site where the sheep were being held in by temporary fencing. They had free access to this over 3 or 4 winters, but they didn't touch the scrub, which you can see has now grown to be the height of people. So because you give them a choice, the sheep will feed on the bit which is easiest and tastiest. So they went to the nice grassy areas and left the scrubby bits, because let's face it, if you were a sheep or a cow, would you want to eat a mouthful of scrub, all this woody material, especially in the winter when, remember, the leaves have died, so they're not going to taste especially good, but the grass grows even in the winter, doesn't it? So it's still fresh and nutritious. So if you're grazing in the winter, you will have a problem that scrub, unless you overstock or keep the animals in there too long, in which case they lose condition, which is very bad for them, you won't get rid of scrub. The scrub will continue to grow because the stock will tend to leave it alone. You can see this enormous pile here, look, of scrub that's been cut from this area, and the volunteers here are going at it, trying to get even more cut. And the idea was that this spring on this site, we were going to put sheep in to stop the scrub coming back, but unfortunately we can't do that because the grazer is not happy at the moment because one of his sheep has been attacked by a dog. So no grazier at present. So it looks like we'll go out there cutting the scrub again in a year or so. Cattle. Now I think you can see in this picture how you've got a more mixed height. You've got things like the thistles that they've left and nettles perhaps. So there is a variety. The cattle concentrate themselves in certain areas even more than sheep. And this actually is a very interesting slide that I took from Farmers Weekly, because what we've got here are not only cows, but sheep feeding with them. And that can often be a very good combination, because the sheep will tackle some areas that the cows will ignore, and the sheep will ignore some areas that the cows favour. So you get not only the difference caused by them, each individual type of animal choosing certain bits, but the fact you've got 2 sorts of animals in there together, you get even more of a mixed sward. So very good idea if you can do it, and it doesn't take any more work actually for you as the person looking after them, because you've got to go and check the cows every day anyway, so that's no harder to look at the sheep as well while you're there.
Hi, Nick.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, there is a question just come up in the chat about cutting. I don't know if this is an appropriate time to
let's go for it.
That now, unless Sarah wanted to say it herself. But up until now, I have mown all my small meadow to under 5 centimetres. Although I do remove the cuttings, what damage have I caused over 4 years of cutting it? all too low. Thank you. So that's
we
you're
are.
cutting the meadow to under 5 centimeters, but they're removing all the cuttings.
Yeah.
What damage may she
Yeah.
have caused over the
It does depend a lot on what was growing in the first place and what you've noticed as a result of the original cutting. So if you can see that the meadow is improving and you're getting more different variety, that's not very good English, you're getting a greater variety of plants as a result of these cuts, then it's going the right way. You could relax the cutting and come up a bit higher. But if you're not seeing much change, then possibly cutting it that bit lower is a good thing. I don't know. If you've got too much fertility in the soil and you've got to get rid of that fertility, then to be honest, I think that cutting it a bit lower won't have done any harm at all. But if you've already got the thing into fairly good condition, the idea of cutting it at about 5 centimeters is just that it allows small germinating things that haven't got very big yet to remain alive. You don't nip the growing points out of them. So it won't have done lasting damage, is the good news. It might have improved it, is the even better news, if it's still too fertile. And if it is about right at the moment, then you can just go from now on, you can cut it so that you've got different, a slightly more relaxed regime with a slightly higher cut. And as you say, you've got several meadows, well, why not cut them at different heights and see what difference it makes? So I would certainly not go below 5 centimeters, but you could try 5 centimeters in some and 7 in others and see what difference it makes and judge for yourself, because every single site is different. Okay.
Thanks, Nick. Sorry, it was only one small meadow, I think. So
was it? I beg your pardon. Well, in that case, you might be, it depends how small the meadow is, but you might be able to try half of it at 5 centimeters and half at 7.
Yeah.
With all these things, a lot of it is experimentation because it varies. The best solution will depend on the soil fertility, the angle of the slope, whether it faces south or west, and so on. So try different things and see what works. It's a long process. It's taken a long time to get our meadows into the mess they are, and I'm afraid it's going to take a long time to get them back to being perfect. So yeah, take it slowly and just try and judge if you can sort out what's down to the weather and what's down to your management, how the management is affecting it.
Thank you.
Welcome. Right, so other grazing options. There are various things you can graze with apart from cows and sheep. You could try horses, but I would suggest short periods unless you've got a very big area and very few horses, because horses will definitely do what they're doing here. They will favour some areas and take the turf down really, really tight, and other areas they won't touch at all. They seem to be quite fussy eaters. Now, this can be really good in certain situations. For instance, among bracken, which we'll come to in a bit, bracken, it's quite possibly the case that horses are the best thing in there. Some big heavy cows are good too, but they will create paths and then they'll feed in those paths and keep those areas short. So you get quite a difference in the vegetation height between the bits they leave and the bits they feed on. But putting horses in for a long period is a bad thing because eventually they eat everything right down really, really short. And I've said ponies rather than horses here because I'm talking about the New Forest and Dartmoor and Shetland type ponies, things which are prepared to eat slightly rougher vegetation. That's what I mean by ponies. Goats. Now, goats are absolutely excellent if you've got really scrubby land. They actually like eating scrub. The trouble is they're extremely difficult to pen in. And if once they've started to eat all the scrub in the area where you put them, they can see a bit more scrub outside the area where you put them. They're very good at getting out, jumping over fences, managing to burrow their way through underneath, wriggle underneath. Goats can be very good at tackling scrub, but they're a bit more difficult to contain within the site. And apparently, I've had this from 2 different people who keep alpacas. Alpacas are really good at looking after a flock of lambs. If you've got lambs and dog walkers are a problem, an alpaca coming in with them will tend, because it's a bit bigger than the sheep, be a deterrent to the dogs, but I can't guarantee that that is always going to work. By the way, this is another picture from Farmers Weekly. Okay, scrub. Are there any other questions about grazing before I plough on?
No.
Okay.
You can carry on, sorry.
That's all right. So grazing, if you only graze in the autumn and winter, as we saw in that picture a little while ago, you will get an increase in amount of scrub. The same if you mow, it could have said mowing here too. Mowing and grazing only in the autumn and winter, you'll get a steady increase in the amount of scrub. If you mow it rather than graze it, the scrub won't be quite so obvious because you'll take the top off it every year, but it will be there, and certain plants like dogwood don't seem to mind having their tops knocked off. They just spread sideways and grow very short but over a big area. The biggest problem with scrub, really, because scrub's got lots of really positive things about it. There is value to scrub, but you don't want your whole field covered in scrub. The problem with scrub is that, as it says here, it pulls up nutrients from deeper in the ground. The roots go down deeper and they're better at sucking up nutrients. So if you cut the scrub and then you just leave it lying where you've cut it, you will increase the amount of rough grass and scrub-like material that grows in the future. So sometimes you see where people have been in woodlands, for instance, and they've cut the edges of the ride, including the scrub that's growing in the edge of the ride, and they leave it in place. And over time, if you might know some sites where you walk through woodland where the edges get regularly cut, you might have noticed, because I certainly have, you get more and more bramble that grows faster and faster and encroaches onto the path further and further. And you might think, I'm sure this bramble didn't used to grow as fast as that. Well, it probably didn't. The bramble is doing very well, thank you, because the scrub that grows around it pulls up the nutrients, it gets cut down, the nutrients get recycled into the soil, and the brambles grow ever faster, as do other big fuggy plants like burdocks and nettles. Whereas the tiny little plants like the wood anemones and the bluebells and things like that, they can't do so well. They don't do anything like as well with the soil being so fertile. So they tend to disappear. And really the only thing you can do with scrub is get it out, totally remove it if you want to control it. So I don't mean you should totally remove scrub from the entire site, but I do mean if there's an area where you don't want scrub, just nibbling at it, being polite and kind to it, won't teach you any lessons. You've got to be really hard on it. And here's an example. This is an English Nature funded operation. English Nature and some other groups got together because this site, you can see it here, still has juniper here. So this site is a slope it's in Oxfordshire. This still got juniper growing on some slopes, but it's disappearing underneath a whole load of other scrub, mostly bramble actually. And so in comes the big digger, and it's scraping away down to the top, through the topsoil, down to the subsoil here. And you can see they've done a big area, look, huge area here. And it's hoped that not only will this allow a recovery in all the herbaceous plants, the tiny flowering plants that used to grow on this slope before all the brambles came in, but that in addition it will allow the juniper to seed, because one of the things that we've discovered is that juniper seed doesn't grow very well unless it's on bare surfaces. So that might explain why junipers are not doing very well in southern England at the moment, is because there's so much nitrogen in the air getting into the soil that lots of plants grow very quickly, but juniper needs a bare area around it for its seeds to grow. So you can see what's happened here is, in effect, they've cleared areas around the junipers, hoping that the seed from the junipers will find some bare spaces. But in addition, they're going to let lots of other things in. You will also notice they're not removing all the scrub. So there's still scrub on this face here, and some of these bushes are not juniper, they're scrub that's been left, because I would advise that you never ever want to take all the scrub out of a field if you're interested in looking after the invertebrates. in any landscape, there's a prevailing wind that blows across it, and a bit of scrub to block the wind makes a huge difference to the invertebrates that live there. If you were outside today and at any point you took your coat off, I bet you put it back on again pretty quickly because the wind was really chilly. And the invertebrates don't have the luxury of grabbing a coat, so they do what they do, which is to hide behind the scrub on the side where the wind is being blocked by the scrub, so they're in the shelter, and it keeps their temperature up by a few degrees, which is crucial to them because they've got no way of raising their temperature. But they can go to the warmest part of the site, and on a windy day with a cold wind, that's on the lee side of the scrub. If you can't afford to do what the English nature were paying for there, you can always get gangs of school kids out, and this is a thing called a tree popper, being operated by an adult here. But as you can see from her very nearly 2 feet in the air, they do take a little bit of work, but the beauty of these compared with simply cutting scrub, here you can see all the red stems of dogwood where it's been cut previously with a strimmer device. The idea here is you grab hold of it with a jaw at the bottom of this device, and then you lean back on the handle and it pulls up not only the little, I think there's a little stem there, probably a hawthorn. It doesn't just pull up the stem, it pulls up the roots. And it's been shown that the amount of time you get before you need to do this again is 3 or 4 times longer if you use a tree popper than if you just go in and cut the material, even if you take it away. So dogwood, as shown here, you cut the tops off, mowing it, strimming it, whatever you do, it comes back. It just spreads and you get lots and lots of tiny little wispy plants. But if you tree pop and pull up the roots, it makes a big difference, and it weakens it substantially, and it comes back far less. So if you wish to, and it may well be that you don't have tree poppers because they are ridiculously expensive. Tree poppers cost about £300 each, and it's basically a stick with a jaw on the end. It is a crazy price, but that's the price they are, I'm afraid. A single company makes them, I think, and they seem to be exploiting that fact rather. However, I'm not either a salesman for that company, as you might have guessed, or someone who knows really why they're so expensive. There might be a very good reason about which I know nothing, but it's much cheaper to send out your school children. You see that that's child labour involved when we can, because they're nice and cheap. And they come out and help us using loppers. And we have adults with them using bigger saws and so on. But snipping at stuff like this will work if you keep doing it after 6 or 7 years of cutting the scrub regularly every year. It will eventually get the message, because you do eventually start to damage the plant, and it does become weaker and weaker until eventually it gives up. The best time to do this cutting is in the summer, but that isn't often the time that you see people out doing it, for the simple reason that people don't want to disturb any nesting birds. So a lot of conservation work removing scrub is done in the winter, and unfortunately that's just like when you go out, assuming you've got some, and you prune your fruit trees in the winter, because it doesn't damage them, but it actually encourages them to flower and have more fruit. And when you prune your scrub in the winter, you prune it quite hard, right down to the ground, but when you prune your scrub in the winter, it doesn't actually kill it. It comes back the next year and probably flowers, tries to set seed all the harder. So winter cutting will work after a very long time, but it does require a lot of effort over many years before you see any difference. And here's a picture of a site just a little way away from where I live. This is a place called Inchcombe Hole here. And you can see that this is, in my opinion, a beautiful grassland, and it's got scrub. And that's a good thing. Every single bit of scrub has a small patch behind it where you can get out of the wind, and the insects can roost there overnight as well. So if they're looking for somewhere to get it in, out of the way of anything that might be trying to eat them overnight, that's a good place to hide. Lots of scrub spread about, but plenty of space between as well. I think actually this field is perhaps a little bit too scrubby for true grassland specialist invertebrates, but it's about right for most generalists, and this field does teem with insects. This field was, by the way, about 7 years previous to this photo, this field was an arable field. It's just been left to revert. And you can see that it's turning into a nice bit of chalk grassland, rather like over here, which, because of its very steep slope, has remained largely scrub free, because there's so little nutrient in these steep slopes that the scrub doesn't grow. And that's something that is worth knowing. If you've got a field which has got a steep slope on one part, but it's relatively flat somewhere else, the scrub is almost certain to be worse on the flatter part, because that's where the nutrients wash down to. Okay, just a quick word about fertilizer, and the word is no. Avoid it completely. The reason that this field is so monoculture, and the wheat, spring wheat, or whichever cereal crop this is growing so well, is the fertilizer. It encourages the grasses. It doesn't encourage much else. If anything else dared to come in, I suspect it would be sprayed off. So fertilizers, bad, avoid. And that includes animal dung. I didn't mention when we were talking about grazing, I should have done. I'm glad I reminded myself that if you can, you want to stop the animals spending the night and leaving dung in large quantities on the best bits of the site. So if you've got areas which are quite flower rich and some other areas that aren't so flower rich, try to encourage the animals to go to the not so flower rich parts by putting low water there, for instance, and fencing off the bits which are flower rich if you can, temporarily. Don't feed the animals when they're on your site, grazing for conservation purposes, because the feed you give them will go through them and in their dung will help to fertilize the land. The idea is that they're eating the grass, various other bits and pieces, and then they take that with them in their meat when they leave, so they're reducing the fertility. This shows that it's not just that I don't like tractors. I've shown plenty of tractors, I must like tractors, and farmers spreading fertilizer. There's a good reason for it. It isn't just simply that I don't like it. So here we've got on the bottom of each of these scales, all four, is the amount of fertilizer, with the right hand side being the largest amount. So from 5 grams per square meter or whatever it was, I don't know. It doesn't say, does it? Anyway, 5 to 500. And you can see this is SR, species richness. The number of different plants that grow in this field is reducing as we increase the amount of fertilizer. And the same here, except that this time it's looking at individual species and whether, let's suppose we talk about scabious. How much scabious do you get in the field? As you increase the amount of fertilizer, the number of flowering plants goes down. Could be some other plant, but I just chose scabious. Now, here we've got the mean species abundance, because some species will grow better when you put the fertilizer on, but actually it isn't just that there is less diversity. Most things become less abundant. And then finally, there's some geometric mean, which I'm afraid, not being a statistician, I don't quite know what it means, but I think it means it's those three combined. And it shows how initially you might get a slight increase in the abundance of plants, but it gradually falls away with less and less species having a high abundance. So fertilizer damages the result we want is not achieved by adding fertilizer. Quite the opposite, we want to get rid of it. And speaking of going to the opposite, it's almost as if I've written this on purpose. We can do something to reduce the growth of grass and plants which might smother and compete with our smaller, more delicate plants. We can add yellow rattle. And this plant is able to insert its own roots into the root systems of certain grasses. Now, I don't think it can get into the roots of every single grass, but it can get into most grasses. Now, I've been told by several people that red barksia is another plant which can do this, but I've looked online repeatedly and I've never found any evidence online, which doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's not been documented that I can find. But yellow rattle is clearly documented in many different places as being a plant that will decrease both the density and the height of grass. and other plants then get a chance to compete with them. And you will see more flowers in grass which has yellow rattle added to it, and you will in the same sort of fields without yellow rattle. But you have to be careful to put yellow rattle in that you can't mow until perhaps late July, because if you do, you'll kill the yellow rattle. It's an annual plant, and annual plants, as you can guess, they're going to start to grow, flower, set seed and die. If they start to grow and you mow it, they never set the seed, and there's nothing after that. There's nothing to come back. The roots just die as soon as the plant's cut. So if you're going to put yellow rattle into the field, it has to be one where you've already got the fertility down. It probably wouldn't work too well. I don't think it would compete well with grass if the grass was really dominant. But you have to get the fertility down first so that you're not mowing repeatedly. And just to show how effective this can be, here we've got a strip 18 months after this was planted with, there's some little tubes, I don't know if you can see, with hawthorn and such. This is a hedge, and it was seeded with yellow rattle in the bare ground that the plants were put into. So this is a relatively open sward, isn't it? The yellow rattle has stopped the grass. Here, this was also cleared, but not seeded with yellow rattle, just the trees were planted in. Look at the grass. Now, I have to tell you, trying to be objective and fair and all that 4 years on, these two look the same. The plants here, the bits of hedging, have grown just as successfully as they did here. But you can see the difference that the yellow rattle has made. These two strips are in the same field. In fact, this strip on the left is below the strip on the right. If you look just here, there's sort of a dog leg. There's the bit with the yellow rattle, which is lower down the field, and was assumed that it would have higher nutrient status, which is why the yellow rattle was put in. This section higher up, being on a slope, the nutrients were assumed would be less, so no yellow rattle was put in there as an experiment to see what the difference was. Initially, it looked like yellow rattle made a huge difference, and that we assumed the hedging plants would get away brilliantly. In actual fact, it didn't make much difference long term, but you can see the difference yellow rattle makes short term. Talk about soils briefly. I'm not going to claim to be an expert here because I'm not. I'm just telling you that this is what I've observed. Chalk and limestones are probably the easiest to work on if you want to get yourself back to some sort of wildflower meadow, because they very quickly respond. Bare chalk, where it's really bare and nutrient poor, this hasn't been scraped by any sort of machinery that's been in there to remove scrub. This is the bank that's left over when a quarry finished working. So yes, it was scraped originally when they took all the soil away in the quarrying process, but that was probably 30 years previously. It's just been left. And gradually scrub is coming back in on the top. Look where there's a bit more nutrient because there was topsoil still there. And here in this field, which is a flat area, there's obviously more growth than there is there. But bare chalk is very slow to scrub, and this bare ground, you can see, I think, from this picture, the sun is shining on it. This area gets really warm, so it's excellent for all sorts of rare invertebrates that need that extra bit of warmth. If you've been outside today, you can understand why an invertebrate might want to go somewhere that's slightly warmer than average. This is a bit that provides that warmth, and they can bask here and warm up and then fly off to these bits of vegetation here. So this area is mown every year, and it still looks pretty good, despite the fact that they leave the arisings, because it was originally like this. It was bare chalk. But because they leave the arisings, it's now got the beginnings of a topsoil forming. And it's a great shame that it is mown annually. It's a shame they don't take the arisings away. It would be even more beautiful and much more diverse with its flowers. It used to be, but it's slowly losing that diversity. But as this is earmarked to be light industrial units, perhaps it doesn't matter too much. Great shame. It is beautiful. Got lots and lots and lots of scarce plants and scarce invertebrates, but I'm afraid it's all been earmarked because it's what's called a brownfield site. It's an ex-quarry, and therefore it's destined to be turned into light industrial units. Clays and acid soils, they are much more difficult than the limestones and the chalks, because limestones and chalks are just naturally less fertile. They're what are called porous, which means when it rains, the water washes straight through them. This is the chalks and the limestones, and it washes out the minerals and the fertility. But most acid rocks tend to form on flat ground. They form where there used to be a river valley or something like that. And quite often the soil is very deep, and quite often it's impervious. That is to say, water can't get through it. So when the water comes in, it stands around, it causes the plants to rot, and it forms a very fertile topsoil. That's why many of those areas which are relatively flat and acid soil are used for farming, because they're extremely good for growing crops. The reason I've said here, scraping topsoil from your clay soils and your acid soils to an extent is probably not an option, is just because of the amount there is. You've got such a depth that you'd have to create a huge hole to get down to anything that was less fertile. Now, this does happen in some places. You might know in the north of Bucks, for instance. I'm not quite sure about the north of Oxfordshire, but certainly the north of Bucks, there are quite a few clay quarries where the clay was taken out and used to make bricks. And where they've left it, right down at the very, very low fertility subsoil that was the clay from very deep layers, those are quite rich. They are floristically diverse because it's so poor, but we're talking about holes in the ground which are many, many meters deep. So it's not something you can easily do in the average meadow. Something you can try, if you've got a place where this makes sense, is to spread some concrete rubble across the surface. Now, you have to be really careful. If you're putting it onto an access track or something, that's fine. And it will allow other plants to grow because it reduces the acidity slightly, but it also helps with the drainage. And it makes it less fertile just in a very small area around the rubble. But obviously you can't go spreading great big lumps of concrete about, or even small bits of concrete about, if you want to mow the area, because it's going to mess up the mower, isn't it? One of the things that's suggested is that if you've got that sort of soil and the plants are growing really vigorously, then use heavy ponies like this. Even bigger horses would be even better, or really big cattle, because when they walk about, especially when the ground is wet, they churn it up and they create bare ground, which allows things to germinate. So although it looks a bit of a mess when they're doing it, it can have a positive spin-off. In fact, there's a site in Oxfordshire where they've got some very rare flowers, and it's the result of the site being used in the past for motorbike scrambling. So there were motorbikes were racing around on this site all through the winter, churning it up into a real quagmire. But once the motorbikes were retired from the site, it redeveloped a most fantastic flora because of all the disturbance. So disturbance can be a good thing, even though it looks a mess. And what these ponies are doing, led here by this lady, I took this picture from somewhere and I can't remember now, and I thought I'd put this on here. But anyway, the horse here is dragging behind it a machine which is doing what's called bruising. So it's not cutting the bracken, it's just squashing it flat. And that lowers the fertility of the bracken and makes it apparently grow more slowly. So you get these areas where the bracken is growing more slowly. The taller bracken around it acts a bit like the scrub in our grassland pictures. It acts as a windbreak. So these creating like miniature woodland glades in amongst the bracken. So bruising is something you can try. Some of you might be wondering, what about burning it? Well, yes, you can, but it gets out of control, and burning is not recommended anymore as a method of looking after bracken, just because there's been too many occasions when people have started burning bracken, usually in the autumn when it seemed like a really good idea because it was a perfect day for it, and then the wind gets up and the fire gets much bigger than anyone intended. You can put livestock in amongst bracken, but you do need to be careful. If you leave them in there and you don't check them very regularly, because they can be poisoned by it. So they won't be poisoned by bracken if there's other food for them to eat, if they can find enough grass. But if they get to the point where they've eaten everything that was edible without poisoning themselves, to then start to eat the bracken because they're so hungry. So you've got to be a bit careful. Bracken's very difficult, and that's one of the problems of acid soils. But a bigger problem for most of us trying to look after acid and clay soils with any sort of wildflower meadow in mind is that it's just so nutrient rich, and you have got to do lots and lots and lots of mowing and lots of removing of the arisings before you get the fertility down. And moving on to woodlands, that's us moving away from grasslands or flower-rich grasslands. So let's just check whether anyone wants to ask anything at this point.
Hello, yeah, there is one question. I don't know to bring it up now. My colleague Martin says, from his personal observation, red Bartsia definitely works on clay soils. There we go.
Right. Thank you.
And Steve asks, he has a long established small meadow. Do you know where he can buy horseshoe vetch plugs, as I have chalk hill blues visiting but not breeding?
I would suggest, because I give them seed every year so that they can grow horseshoe vetch for exactly this sort of purpose, a place called Lindengate Charity, which is near Wendover.
Oh yes, I know. I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you. I will tell you now that I went recently planting on a golf course where they get chalk hill blue visiting. So I went there with a person who is a member of that golf club, and with permission of the golf club, we've planted horseshoe vetch. Now I've got about 30 plants I've grown myself, but this golf club member said, well, I'll buy some from Lindengate and take them along. How much are they? And I said, I think you'll pay about £5 a plant. Well, he got there and mentioned by name, and they charged him £8. So be aware that horseshoe vetch is expensive to buy. You'll find it's one of the most expensive plants because it's very difficult to germinate. But if you do pay £8 for a plant at Lindengate, you get a massive plant. So we're not talking about a seedling, we're talking about a 3-year-old, very substantial plant in a sort of 8 centimetre, no, not 8 centimetre, 8-inch circumference pot. So they're big plants, they're very good plants, very healthy plants, but they are expensive wherever you buy them. And they're difficult to germinate, so simply buying seed and spreading it is not often effective. Okay, woodlands, unless any more questions?
No, we're all good for now. Thank you.
Okey-doke. I've tried to explain at the top here about changing baseline expectations. If we could go back, and obviously we can't, a couple of 100 years or even 100 years and look at woodland, it would have been completely different to that we see around us at the moment, because there are very few woods today where anyone is working them on a regular basis. So the picture I put in here on the right looks a bit like, I imagine, the woodland might have looked, because this one is being worked. So this is a woodland where you can't see it actually because they've just been through and cleared it, but they take the hazel out and they use it to make bits of fencing.
Sorry, Nick, you've gone really quiet.
Have I? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, is that better? Perhaps I moved my microphone, I don't remember doing it. So anyway, as I was saying, in this woodland on the right, they work it regularly, taking out hazel, which they make into hazel fencing. As a result, I hope you can see, not only you can see between the trees and it looks light in there, but you can see green stuff growing. Quite a lot of grassy and other floristic types in here. Amongst the brash from the hazel that's been cut down. But here, look, this woodland is much more typical of what we see around us these days when we go into a wood. You can't really see through the wood. Everything's growing very, very close together. And the floor is pretty bare. There's a bit of ivy here and there, that might be bramble, but there's not much in there because there isn't enough light. So woodlands have changed from what they used to be, because in the past, they were a working environment. People made their living by working in the woodland. And even if it was a bit of woodland that wasn't especially economically viable, it was worked because local people would go in and get the wood they needed for house building and cooking. You cast your mind back, you've got to remember that people didn't have access to gas, just absolutely non-starter. There wasn't any gas. Even if they were lucky enough to live somewhere with coal, it's unlikely many people could have cooked with coal until mining got going properly, and then the railway started spreading it around. Before that, most people cooked by collecting wood from their local wood and using wood to cook. So all the woods were regularly worked. People would have certain areas that they were allowed by law to collect the firewood, and those areas would have been quite open compared with what we see today, where no one goes in and collects anything. Nobody does anything with it. It gets very dark, and as a result, there are very few flowers in areas that used to have lots. People might be thinking, what about bluebells? Well, yes, some woods are fantastic, but bluebells flower, don't they, very early in the year before the leaves are on the trees. That's why bluebells are so successful, even in our modern woodlands, because they flower early enough that they can get their leaves above the ground before the deciduous trees in the woodland have got their leaves open. So there's plenty of light early in the year before the leaves get their canopy on the top. But everything that grows later in the year tends to have vanished because it just doesn't get enough light anymore. Okay, well, enough about that. That's one of my getting on a soapbox things about the way woodlands are managed. I don't like it. The good thing about woodlands, even these unmanaged woodlands, is that they're not covered in chemicals. No one in the past ever thought it was a good idea to throw chemicals into woodlands because, for a start, back in the days I'm talking about, there weren't really any chemicals. And ever since there have been agricultural chemicals, they've been used on farmed land rather than in woodlands. There was no point throwing chemicals at trees that have been growing for 100 years already, because they've mostly done the growing they're going to do before you cut them down. So woodlands actually have some extremely rich soil in terms of the seed bank. So if you can get in and clear a bit, you normally get really good flowering. Not true everywhere, and I'm sure you could be like a landowner I work with and be really unlucky. He's gone in, he's cleared quite a lot this last winter, and he's now in despair because he's got masses of nettles. He used to have some, but now he's let the light in, he's got far more. And that's a phase, I think. If we can go in there and cut the nettles every now and again, and eventually they will weaken. But eventually, I'm sure that woodland too, like others I've seen that have been worked on, once you let the light in, you get more flowers. How should you let the light into a woodland? Well, there are lots of bits of information about this, but they're all basically the same. They say you should have a wide ride. These are in meters, look, so this is 10 meters. It isn't unusual to see rides at 15 meters. We don't want a narrow footpath, we want a wide ride. And either side of it, you've got areas which you cut occasionally. So right down the center, you might be mowing this, it says here 3 times a year. That's because they're not collecting their cuttings. They should be, and then they only need to mow it once. The edges are cut less often, so it grows quite well. But you have to be a bit careful. I point out to people, if you're thinking to try this, if you cut every 4 years, you might find that some of this scrub that will generate here will have become such a size, the stems will be so thick that you'll have trouble cutting it with a standard mower or flail. You might need to go something heavier duty. So 2 years is standard for most people with standard equipment, because you can't get anything. If you try it after 3 years, you might get away with it. Try it after 4 years, you might damage the equipment. On the sides, we're talking more about chainsaws here, but we're going in, and the idea is to cut this perhaps after 7 years, and then this bit after 15, and then back to this bit, and then to that bit, and so on. So that you've always got one side of the ride where the vegetation is fairly low, and one side where it's high, a mix of heights. So we've got the really low bit, slightly higher, a bit higher still, and the highest. But they're both sides of the ride, you can see, are lower than the trees. The idea is that it's all about getting these nice, warm, bright spaces. So the distance between the trees has got to be sufficient that the sunlight can shine in and warm up the ground. And the lower side obviously will get warmer because it's going to get more light in here, I would think, than it is on this side where those little bushes are going to cause some shading. But there are invertebrates that prefer the shady side, so you've got to cater for them as well. Okay, so this is the way we would expect woodland to look if it's being managed for biodiversity. And we don't just want to make something that looks like it was designed by a man with a ruler, because the wind will whistle down. You've heard the expression wind tunnel. So the idea is to have your ride at sort of a standard width and then widen it out and make scallops, and then make another scallop the other side, but also to put little bends into this so that the ride system is not a straight line. If you go to quite a lot of Forestry Commission woodlands, you'll see straight rides because they were built with a view to getting the equipment in to extract the timber. And it obviously makes good sense. Straight rides, straight intersections, very efficient, but it's not the best in terms of invertebrates. So if you're able to talk to a landowner who's thinking about putting a new ride in or widening his rides, try and get him to adopt this scalloping on opposite sides all the way along, and try to get a bit of a wiggle. So in places you might want the rides to come quite narrow to stop the wind blowing into the next section, because they do become wind tunnels, no question. And here we see an idealized plan. I'm not quite sure whether this really exists. It possibly does because it looks like a real map. And I took this from something called New Forest Guide, which I'm not sure if it's the guide to a part of the New Forest or the guide to the way that forestry ought to be. Anyway, so glades have been created where rides come together. That's a place where they're suggesting make a big opening. The east-west rides running in this direction are the ones where you get the sun shining on the northern side most of the day. So they're the ones where you'll see the biggest benefit from opening up and making them wider, because there'll be one side which is almost always in the shade, but the other side will get lots of sunlight all day long. The fact that they've got these little kinks in the ride system is advantageous because it helps to prevent wind tunnels. And they've gone to a little bit further with this idea by making them narrow, the rides narrow near the edges. As it says here, less conservation value in a ride going in this direction, but even so, these scallops will get warmer edges, and you could make them so that they're elliptical, so they're wider to the north, and therefore the sun will come in more to that edge. And as you can see, the whole idea is to open up parts of the wood, not all of it. You don't want to take the wood away completely. It is a woodland. So you want lots of trees. Many invertebrates are feeding in the canopy. There are a relatively small number compared with those feeding in the canopy, which are down at ground level, but often they're some of our scarcest and equally most beautiful creatures. So we want to give them a chance as well. If it's on a slope, it does add complications to this, because with a slope, you don't necessarily need your rides to be quite so wide. If you think about it, if the slope is to the south, then it's going to mean that a slightly narrower ride will get more sunlight in it. So you could have slightly narrower rides then, but if it slopes to the north, then it's going to be quite a chilly woodland, and therefore you might want the rides even wider than you would expect normally to let the light in. But as I say, every single site is different, and you've got to make judgments about where you make the holes and so on. There might be particular trees you don't like the idea of cutting, so the rides have got to be situated, the scallops and the glades, according to the best place in the wood. And it may well be that whoever owns this land is very fond of the trees, so you've got to be careful when you're telling people about cutting trees out, because at the moment the conservation message that most people have heard is that trees are good. So asking people to cut trees down and improve their woodland by making them a bit lighter is sometimes a bit of a difficult sell. Here we can see a nice bit of woodland. This is in North Bucks, and you can see I'm actually standing here in a glade that's, well, a scallop, I suppose, that's been cut. This side is the side which usually gets least light, and we haven't persuaded the landowner here to go back very far, so the trees are really close to the edge along here, look. But on this side we've got quite a big clearing, And this has been cut. This is probably due for a cut in about a year's time when this picture was taken. So this is regrowing. This side has been cut more recently, but this side is getting quite big again now. So in this wood, you can see the benefit because it's obvious that where it's being cut and the light's coming and the bluebells are doing really well. And when this is cut again, I don't think I've been back since this picture was taken, which was 3 years ago, at the right time to see. But when this is cut, the bluebells in there and the wood anemones are amazing. But gradually they get shaded out by the scrub coming up, but then it's cut and it goes round and round in a cycle. Very, very nice woodland. Just to mention that I think it really is a type of woodland, scrubby woodland, stuff that's turning back into woodland from being meadows. It's very useful, scrub, whether you've got it in the woodland. So go back to the last picture, you could argue that this is scrub. It's just little bushes and things haven't turned into trees yet. Some of them never will. Some of these plants are the sorts of things like hazel, holly perhaps, they never get really big, or they rarely get very big. And these are blackthorn, and there might be bits of buckthorn and privet and so on mixed in with them, and they're never going to get very big. So this is scrub. And this particular site here, this is again in North Bucks. This one was developed from a field that used to be grazed very heavily with cows, and then there were no cows in it for about 15 years. The idea was that the person who owned it was going to flood it, or allow it to flood in the winter so that it was good for wading birds. But the project got slightly scuppered. It didn't ever flood in the way that was intended, so the field was left. And this blackthorn is developed, along with hawthorn and privet, as I say, and it is now an absolutely amazing site for all sorts of invertebrates, because there are lots of invertebrates that live in this sort of unmanaged scrub, many rare things. So as a butterfly lover, I'm always very pleased to go here because it's got white letter hair streak, brown hair streak and black hair streak. We've not seen green hair streak, but there are quite a lot of bits in North Oxfordshire and North Bucks where there's areas like this, which to the untrained eye would look like there's a bit of a field that no one's looking after, but they are absolute hotspots for wildlife. And one of the beauties of this place is that because no one planted it, it's a real higgledy-piggledy mess of the bushes growing up. In effect, you've got spaces between them. Every now and again, you'll go down one of these little paths between and find you've come to a dead end and have to retreat. It's like a maze. But it also means that it's really sheltered. On a windy day, you can come in here and it's lovely and warm, because these bushes grow all over the place in great big lumps and clumps, and it makes it a very warm site. And we've now got grazing restored between the scrub, and we're doing some work parties with this landowner to control this scrub so it doesn't completely close up the spaces between them. Very, very good. If you can, you want to retain scrub both within the wood and around the outside of the wood. Let it expand slightly into the fields outside, into the margins of the fields. It's very useful to a whole load of different sorts of wildlife. And just in case you get asked about removing trees or planting trees, there are many people who will tell you that if they can see a bit of grassland that appears not to be being used for anything, you should put trees into it, because that will save us from global warming. But I just wanted to show you this figure, which comes from a government publication, the Natural Environment Agency. And what they're suggesting is that if you add these numbers together, you get the total amount of carbon that's in an area. And you can see that woodland does contain the most, but it depends what happens to this woodland, because look, 70 of the tons per hectare are in the vegetation. So if this coniferous woodland is taken away and used to make pallets and then burnt, that goes back into the atmosphere. If it's here in this woodland and it's taken away and used, I don't know, pallets for some sort of electricity generation, then it's going back into the atmosphere. So actually, although this could be absolutely superb, it depends what happens to the wood after the vegetation has absorbed the carbon. If that wood is going to be around for decades and hundreds of years perhaps, because it's made into solid furniture that's kept, or it's built into some sort of a construction project and it stays there, brilliant. But otherwise, there are some sites that are even better, like fens, marshes, swamps and bogs, shrubby heathland and acid grassland. Look. So these can actually be better depending on what happens to the vegetation. So please don't let people tell you that you should plant your grassland with trees because it's better for the planet. That isn't necessarily true. If you can guarantee that those trees will not be used for anything that destroys the fabric of the wood in the trees, for hundreds of years, it is definitely true that woodland can absorb more carbon. But if we're talking about a bit of woodland that's been planted now because it's a government grant, and in 15 years it's all going to be cut down and that's going to be burnt, then it is not true. And your grasslands, which are more likely to stay as grasslands because grasslands tend to, whereas woodlands do get worked and the timber is taken out because it's useful, but the grass can't often be sold for anything. So if the grassland stays in place, it might be nearly as good as the woodland. So it's fairly close, and it all depends on what happens to the trees. Some grasslands are better than others at absorbing carbon, but they're all pretty good, look. So just to counter the argument that trees are definitely best, depends a bit on what happens to the vegetation. Therefore, in my opinion, taking a few trees out of woodland in order to make the grasslands in the woodland more extensive and to get more flowers into the woodland is a good thing. You're not disturbing the soil to any extent, which releases carbon, but you are taking some of the trees out. Now, unfortunately, the amount of tree you're likely to be taking out is probably not economically viable in the sense that no one's going to pay you to come and collect it. So I suspect that wood will just be left to rot down. Hopefully, if it's left stacked somewhere in the wood to rot down as what's called a habitat pile, the nutrients go back into the soil. It is a bad thing to burn that wood just to get rid of it. So where you can, try and stack it. And while I'm on that subject, it's best to stack it standing up. You almost always see piles of wood left as habitat piles, which are horizontal, laying flat on the floor. If you can stack it against a tree trunk, it's better, especially if you bury the ends of the cut material into the soil. So there's an area that's always stuck in the damp soil, because no end of invertebrates during the summer will move down inside this dead trunk. If there's something which eats dead wood, they'll move down inside the dead trunks towards the damper end, which is cooler and damper. And then when the weather gets cooler again, they'll move back up to an area which is drier and warmer. If it's all laying flat on the floor, they can move within the trunk, but it's all at roughly the same amount of wet and cold, if you see what I mean. They find it very difficult. Most invertebrates that feed on dead wood don't break out of the log they're in and look for a different one, which is better. They stay in the log where where the egg was laid, and they move through that log looking for areas which suit them in terms of the temperature and the dampness. So it's best to stand the wood vertically with one end buried slightly. Hard work, but at least if you stack it up as opposed to lay it flat, there's a better chance that there'll be different amounts of moisture at different ends of the log. Urban spaces. We're getting towards the end, folks. Urban spaces. Basically, it's the same thing, but obviously you've got more trouble in an urban space with people coming along who don't understand why you're doing what you're doing and disagreeing with what you're doing, because there'll be many more people using that space, and a lot of them won't understand the reason that you're trying to do things. So very important to have something like this plant life sign explaining to people why it looks the way it does. No need to make an awful lot of clutter on the sign. I wouldn't put a lot in. This is a sign you might have spotted, the sharp-eyed amongst you, that's probably everybody, but it says down the bottom here that the town where I live, we're trying to get B-town status. So we're creating wildflower meadows in the town, and we're putting these signs up, or some very similar actually, created by the local council, that explain to people that although in the past this bit used to be cut we're not cutting it anymore to see if we can get wildflowers there for the bees. So far, response is positive, but there are bound to be some people who are going to moan when we get to midsummer and the grass looks a bit untidy. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. It's also a good idea when you're going into these urban areas and you're doing something like, for instance, removing trees or trying to get a wildflower meadow established, that you put in some colourful annuals at first, because the plants you really want are perennials, which means they live for a long time. But very often perennials will not flower at first. So when they first begin to grow, they might be 2 or 3 years before there's a flower. So people might look at an area which they know used to be mowed and they could sit there and have a picnic, or they could play football with the kids. And they think, what have they done to that? That's a mess. Look at it, it's all full of weeds. But if you put something like this in, a handful of mostly American, I suspect, annuals, then, sorry, I don't mean to be rude to the Americans, but I just wonder why there was reach for the American poppies and other plants from the American prairies for our annuals rather than the British ones. The annuals give a hint to people who perhaps wouldn't understand that something is happening that will make this site better in the future. And the annuals will persist for a bit because some of that seed will regrow over the next few years while your perennials get established. It's also a very good idea in urban spaces to go out and mow some bits between the longer grass, so it's obvious to people that the whole idea is to have an area that people can get into and enjoy, and it isn't simply left because all the people who work for the Parks Department have got coronavirus or are on strike because they don't get paid enough or something. This picture on the right is actually my own garden, showing how we cut paths through the longer grass because it just makes it easier to get around. But it does give the impression, doesn't it, that somebody is actually looking after it. And here, this is from a picture from a magazine called Grow Veg, which is slightly odd because they're not growing any veg. But anyway, this is from an urban space showing how paths have been cut, again, to let people in, but it really gives the feeling that this is a managed space that's being well cared for. So having these nice, neatly trimmed paths in an open space lets people see that people are taking care of it, and the bits that are longer by design. It's not through laziness or the fact that nobody bothered. I'm coming towards the end, folks. So you've been very patient if you've been able to listen and take all this in. Can you, when you go out looking at people's land, just think about where you are and what's likely to be there to make it worth doing whatever it is you've been asked to do. So this is an aerial picture of a bit of Cambridgeshire, not very far from where my wife was born. And I know that almost all the area around there is growing crops, oilseed rape, barley, wheat, and so on. But there are a very few tiny bits of woodland which have been kept by people who like to go either rearing pheasants to shoot or hunting foxes. It's the hunting brigade that led to these little woodlands being retained in the landscape. But they're all so far apart that it's very unlikely that any rare woodland invertebrates can persist in them because they're a bit small. And if the weather is really bad for a year, or most of the trees are cut down one year because it's the time when they're all ready for harvesting, and you take the lot because it's not economic to do it piecemeal, then the invertebrate populations are lost at those times, and they just can't get back because they've got this absolute massive area all around them that's completely unsuitable. So when you go and look at people's land to give them advice, if they say to you, I saw a thing on the telly, I did have this once, I saw a thing on the telly the other day about the large blue butterfly coming back to Britain. I thought it'd be really nice to put that onto my meadow. So can you tell me, please, I've got a bit of land just outside Oxford. How will I go about putting the large blue on that land? And I had to explain, well, the large blue isn't going to come on its own. And even if you put it in, it isn't awfully likely to persist unless you've got hectares and hectares of the right habitat, which is a bit unlikely on the sorts of soil you've got around Oxford. It's possible on some of it, but it's unlikely on most of it. It would be such a small, isolated population that the first time something went wrong, it would be exterminated and it wouldn't come back. People can have somewhat unrealistic expectations of the plants that they can grow, of the invertebrates that they can see in the bits of land they're looking after. So you have to bear this in mind when you give advice. If it's a north-facing site and they're hoping to see it covered in some particular sort of orchid that you know only grows in very sunny places, it's not likely, is it? Even if they do their management very carefully. Similarly, if they've got a south-facing site that gets really warm and dry, but they want to see it covered in, let's say, those fritillaries, I don't mean the butterflies, but the plants that grow around Italy and such, that's not likely to happen, is it? Because they don't need that sort of habitat. So try and make people aware when you're giving them advice about what they can do with their own land that will be the best thing there for diversity, and encourage them to enjoy what they get rather than hope for things which aren't possible. So brings me to my final point, which is before you go, folks, that I'm hoping to see you on Saturday, and I'd be very grateful, as would Maria, who is our host at Colestroke Farm on Saturday, very grateful to know how many of you are coming along on Saturday, because I hardly dare say this, it will start a precedent. I never provide people with food at my dues, I'm far too mean, but Maria is preparing to give people buns to celebrate Easter. So, well, not Easter, but the preparation for it. So she wants to know how many people are coming, and I'm keen to know too, because I've got some paperwork I'll be bringing along. So could you please, if you're coming on Saturday, raise a hand now so that Carla can count up